My daughter texted at exactly 9:42 a.m., just as I was steeping the second flush, Darjeeling I reserve for quiet mornings. The phone buzzed once beside my antique china cup, resting on a linen napkin I had embroidered by hand. I expected something simple. A photo of Emma's new winter coat, a question about the roast recipe, a last-minute request for me to pick up artisan bread from the corner bakery. Instead, I read, "We've decided to spend Christmas with Michael's parents, Shope, you understand." There it was. All polished manners and clean punctuation. 7 words to unseat nearly 70 years of ritual. I read it twice, then a third time. I placed the phone face down on the table, adjusted the tea cozy, and let the silence curl around me like smoke from a blown-out candle. My fingers didn't tremble. That would have been too easy. Instead, they folded neatly into my lap, calm and cold as marble. My heartbeat remained steady, and my face, had someone seen it, might have looked serene. But beneath the stillness, a familiar ache began its slow stretch. Not anger, not even disappointment, but the dull, brittle weight of being quietly dismissed. Again, I looked out the window. Snow was beginning to fall over the city, thin, deliberate flakes that seemed to know exactly where they wanted to land. Across the street, Mrs. Danvers was struggling with her wreath, and below her, the florist was arranging white amaryllis in the window like a nativity. Everything was performing Christmas, except me. I reached for my guest list. The paper was heavy, gold-edged, hand-torn. I'd been working on it for weeks. Not a party, not really. A gathering. A dinner that spoke in hushed tones and clinked crystal glasses over ideas rather than gossip. The sort of event I used to imagine hosting when I was younger and still believed influence was earned, not inherited through marriage or headlines. I glanced at the names. Margaret Bellemure, current governor, who once quoted my research in a policy address. 2 CEOs I'd mentored indirectly through board initiatives. A museum curator. An education reformist. People who valued thought, not just lineage. Not one of them shared my blood. I lifted my phone again and reread Clarabelle's message. "We've decided," as if I'd been consulted. "Hope you understand." The polite blade. Because nothing cuts deeper than weaponized civility. And yet, I smiled. Because it was so Clarabelle. Clarabelle Vaughan Langston, my daughter. Blonde, poised, married into money by 26, published in glossy magazines by 28, and fully fluent in the language of curated distance by 30. She'd become the kind of woman who used phrases like, "let's circle back," and "it's just optics" in casual conversation. A woman whose holiday tables now seated stylists and donors before extended family. A woman who'd once said to me without irony, "Mom, maybe tone down the history stuff at brunch? Michael's parents think academia is a bit elitist." Michael Langston, developer, political donor, fortunate jawline, wears tartan blazers unironically and uses the phrase "old money values" as a punchline while cashing in on public contracts. I never disliked him, I just never quite found the door into his world. Or perhaps, more truthfully, I stopped knocking once I realized they preferred the echo. But Christmas had always been mine. Ever since Clarabelle's father died, I made sure of it. Not out of desperation or guilt, but because it mattered. Because it meant something to build a moment where family felt inevitable, not optional. I made cinnamon rolls from scratch every year. I folded napkins into poinsettias. I kept a box of Clarabelle's childhood ornaments, each tagged with the year she made them, even when they rolled their eyes, even when they forgot to thank me. Even when they arrived late and left early, I prepared Christmas like it was my final thesis. I thought that counted for something. Apparently, it counted less than whatever Michael's parents were serving this year, probably catered. I took another sip of tea, lukewarm now, and adjusted the seating chart in my mind. Margaret would sit at the end near the fireplace. I'd place the literacy foundation chair beside her. The education reformist across from me, he likes to argue. I would wear the navy silk gown I'd saved from the Kennedy Center dinner. And I'd light the cinnamon candle not because it reminded me of Christmas past, but because it reminded me of who I'd been before anyone told me to understand. I picked up my pen, scanned the guest list once more, and added one last name. Governor Bellamy. Then I turned off my phone, refilled the teapot, and watched the snow settle over the city like powdered sugar, quiet, beautiful, and completely indifferent to whether or not I'd been invited. I had spent years making myself invisible so others could shine. It wasn't something I planned. No one wakes up one morning and decides, today, I will become irrelevant. It happens slowly, quietly, like steam escaping a kettle before it ever whistles. One compromise, one favor, one missed thank you at a time. After Roderick died, the world fell unnervingly silent. He passed in the falone of those sharp, rust-colored Octobers where the leaves look like fire and the air like glass. He had been diagnosed in August and was gone by the first frost. No drama, no lengthy hospital goodbyes, just the quiet vanishing of the only person who ever truly knew how I liked my coffee. Clarabelle was 11. I remember because I spent her 12th birthday pretending the cake hadn't deflated in the center. She'd asked for a sleepover. I said yes, even though I'd only slept 2 hours the night before and had a stack of research papers waiting for me like ghosts in the corner of the room. She had no idea how many nights I wept into dish towels, how many mornings I ironed her school blouse while repeating my thesis statement under my breath. I became two people, mother and academic, and both wore sensible shoes. I enrolled in a PhD program 6 months after Roderick's funeral, not because I wanted more degrees, but because I needed the distraction. I needed to know that I could still finish something, even when everything else had been taken from me. We didn't have money for tutors or new furniture, but Clarabelle never went without. She had field trips and ballet and a room painted sky blue because she once said it made her feel like she was flying. I clipped coupons. I took night shifts at the university library and adjunct courses no one else wanted. I ate boxed soup for months so she could have her braces tightened on schedule. And I never resented it. Not then. Not when she was a girl who needed protecting. But children grow, and gratitude doesn't always grow with them. By the time Clarabelle turned 24, she had stopped asking me about my work. By 26, she had married into a family that didn't believe in tenure unless it came with 7 figures and golf privileges. Michael Langston, the man with a LinkedIn profile longer than his vows, and a father whose name opened more doors than Clarabelle's ever would on her own. But that was the idea, wasn't it? Michael's family weren't bad people, just very good at being the loudest people in every room. They were developers, donors, the kind of people who throw their money at cultural initiatives they can't pronounce. When Clarabelle married into them, I assumed I'd remain at the table. I had earned that much. Instead, I became mom, smiling from the edge of photographs, clutching a casserole dish. Every holiday, I was assigned desserts. "You always bake the best pies," Clarabelle would say, which sounded like a compliment until you realized it meant I would never again be trusted to bring wine or opinions. They began hosting, and I, like clockwork, would bring handcrafted place settings or baskets of curated books one Christmas. I made each of them a custom-bound journal filled with family recipes, photographs, and letters from Clarabelle's childhood. They opened them, politely. Then Michael's mother, Deborah, cleared her throat and passed around silver boxes Rolexes. Real ones. Everyone clapped. Clarabelle kissed her mother-in-law's cheek. And my handmade books were quietly moved to the sideboard. I remember the moment because the room buzzed like a showroom. Everyone admiring stainless steel faces and gold-plated significance while mine went untouched. No one even noticed the inscription inside Clarabelle's copy. To the girl who once wrote stories on napkins, "You were always meant to shine." But she didn't shine toward me anymore. She shined toward chandeliers, toward staged photos, toward the Langstons' winter retreat in Vermont. And I adjusted. I became useful. That's the word for it, isn't it? Useful enough to show up, not essential enough to be missed. There were years where I kept hoping that if I played the game, right, smiled on cue, brought the perfect gifts, didn't talk too much about policy or dead philosophers, they would invite me back to the center of their orbit. But I was never the moon. I was just a satellite. And satellites don't shine. They reflect. So I learned how to make myself small. Not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of being visible only when someone needed something warmed in the oven or wiped off the table. Last year's Christmas was the turning point. The moment I realized invisibility had become expected of me, not requested, expected, like part of the holiday decor. That night, I went home and made myself a cup of peppermint tea. No tears, just stillness. A stillness that said, "This will be the last time I make myself smaller just to fit into someone else's gift box." I didn't say anything to Clarabelle. I just started looking for my own kind of Christmas. They never asked what I did after retirement, so they never found out who I really became. It was always phrased the same way. "Mom's retired now," Clarabelle would say, usually in passing, usually with a kind smile that concealed the subtle edge beneath it. And just like that, I was folded up and stored in the linen closet of conversation. Tidy, safe, harmless. They never asked what I did after retirement, and so, they never found out who I really became. Let me be clear. I didn't retire because I was tired. I retired because I was done playing by the institutional rules of a university system that had long since stopped listening to the voices of women who didn't market themselves like slogans. I left with my dignity intact, my office cleared, and 3 separate offers to consult quietly, of course for education reform initiatives that wanted substance without spectacle. And I said yes. Quietly, of course. That's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you space, silence, room to move. By the time Clarabelle threw me my retirement party, which was really just a brunch with oversized balloons and a mimosa bar, she outsourced to a catering app. I was already reviewing draft legislation on public school accessibility in underfunded districts. I signed the non-disclosure agreement the morning of her party and toasted with orange juice like someone who had no more surprises left. What Clarabelle never understood and perhaps never cared to learn was that education was never just a job for me. It was the language I used to survive, to rebuild, to reach. After Roderick died, teaching kept me sane. But after I left the university, it became my weapon, my currency. My way of making sure no other woman who'd spent her life serving others would feel as erased as I had. So no, I didn't spend retirement reading books and baking muffins, as Michael once joked to a dinner guest. I spent it building something quieter and far more powerful. By year 2, I was sitting on the board of the Maddox Initiative, a nonprofit focused on rethinking early literacy in urban communities. I helped them design a pilot program that merged community mentorship with curriculum reform. It was tedious work surveys, committee reviews, endless data. The kind of work Michael's family calls idealistic overhead. The kind of work that changes lives. Then came the Lenwick Foundation, where I was brought on after the founder heard me speak off the cuff at a library fundraiser. "You have clarity," he said. "And people with money need clarity." I suppose that was his compliment. The third board, Orion Civic Alliance, was Roderick's legacy more than mine. He'd helped launch the organization during his final years, part urban policy, part post-military rehabilitation. When he passed, they kept a seat open for me. "If not by name," the chairman said, "then by merit. Yours." I remember blinking at him for a moment. I hadn't heard my own name attached to merit in years. Last spring, I co-authored a policy proposal advocating for integrated civic history programs in state-funded schools. I didn't expect it to go anywhere. Most white papers disappear into filing cabinets and recycled press releases. But this one didn't. The Governor Margaret Bellamy quoted it in her keynote address at the State Education Summit. Clarabelle never saw the clip. Michael might have. He tends to skim anything involving campaign donors or keyword alerts, but no one mentioned it to me. Not once. I didn't bring it up. Because that's the thing about power that isn't loud, it doesn't beg to be noticed, it just moves the room. Roderick understood that. He was a decorated strategist, both military and municipal. He built war maps and city zoning blueprints with the same precision. He believed in measured responses. He also believed that no one should ever suspect how much power you actually hold until they've already made the mistake of underestimating you. It's how he built coalitions, by letting others think they were leading until they looked up and realized he'd been steering the whole time. When he died, he left me with more than his pension. He left me his notebooks, his strategies, his allies. People who called me Mrs. Vaughn, with the kind of deference my own family had long since stopped offering. And I used those connections not for attention, but for architecture. I began building a version of myself that could exist entirely outside Clarabelle's shadow, one that didn't need approval, or inclusion, or Sunday brunches with Michael's smug cousins. One that could stand on its own, in silence, and still shake the room. You see, I let Clarabelle have her narrative. The glossy family, the holiday photos, the status updates that positioned me as the charming but harmless grandmother with the strong tea and the even stronger silence. What she never realized was that I wasn't waiting to be brought into her world. I had already built my own. And now, with her Christmas text sitting unread in my inbox, I realized something else. I had no interest in being reinvited to a life I had already outgrown. Most mothers dread empty seats at Christmas. Mine were already filled with power. There's a moment, after rejection, when silence can feel like a weapon. Some wield it with pity, others with guilt. But me? I wielded it with planning. It started 3 days after Clarabelle's text. I hadn't responded yet other than that initial, surgically neutral, of course. I'd said it the way one might say bless your heart in the South Civil, polished and almost lethal. But my actual answer was unfolding across 3 notepads and 2 emails. By then, the guest list was nearly full. The first to confirm was Margaret Bellamy, the sitting governor, known as much for her no-nonsense reforms as for her affinity for silk trouser suits and elegantly brutal soundbites. I'd met her briefly at an education summit 4 years ago. She had quoted my policy paper in her opening remarks, then thanked me in person with a quiet handshake and the kind of look that says, "I see you, even if no one else does." Last week, she'd emailed me personally. "Marcella, your recent op-ed on urban literacy funding was exceptional. I'm in town over the holidays. If you're hosting anything quiet, reflective, and well-catered, count me in. No press. Just people who get it." I read the message 3 times. And then I smiled. Within hours, I began rearranging the seating plan. After Margaret came Delilah Chen, CEO of LexIQ, one of the country's fastest-growing ed tech platforms. We'd crossed paths during a board vote last spring, and though she rarely attended anything without a speaking fee or sponsorship deal, she made an exception for my invitation. "If you're hosting it," she said, "it's not for show. That alone makes it worth flying in." Then there was Arun Baldev, head of the Maddox Initiative and a longtime friend of Roderick's. He'd once told me, during a coffee break between sessions, that I had the patience of a monk and the memory of a spy. I took it as the compliment it was. By Thursday, the list included a museum curator who specialized in historical narratives told through underrepresented voices, a woman who had written 4 state-level textbooks and ghostwritten a 5th for someone more famous, a retired Supreme Court justice's daughter who now ran a scholarship fund in Baltimore. Not one of them asked if Clarabelle would be there. Not one of them cared. Because this wasn't about family, and for once, I wasn't pretending it needed to be. I'd hosted dinners before intimate, quiet, thoughtful affairs. But this would be something else. Not ostentatious, not a gala, just curated, intentionally radiant. The menu would be handled by Chef Bennett Louis, a James Beard, recognized genius who usually declined holiday bookings. He said yes when I reminded him I'd helped fund the literacy program he credited with saving his daughter from dropping out of high school. I didn't have to mention Clarabelle once. The music would be provided by a pianist I'd heard during a trip to New Orleans 2 years ago, Stellan Ames, who played like time was bending just to hear him. I wrote him a letter, reminding him of the evening we'd met in a half-empty lounge in the French Quarter, where he played Gershwin for me between jazz sets. He responded with a single line, "Tell me when to arrive." The dress code, formal. I wrote that in bold on the invitation. Not to intimidate, to elevate. Velvet and silk, tailored coats, brooches with meaning. Because if my family was going to exile me to the role of sentimental relic, I was going to remind the world that I knew how to cast a room like a chessboard. The party would take place in my homeonaut, a ballroom, not a hotel suite, but my house. The brownstone Roderick and I had restored brick by brick. I'd once considered downsizing, but something told me this space still had things to say. The dining room would hold 12 guests, 1 long mahogany table polished to a mirror finish. No artificial trees. Real pine, fresh garland, and candles that carried the scent of sandalwood and memory. No one would wear novelty sweaters. No one would bring disposable wine glasses. And no one, thank God, would play All I Want for Christmas on a Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen. Instead, we would discuss education, legacy, the strange intersection of justice and architecture in city planning. We would eat roasted duck and butternut risotto. We would drink things aged longer than Michael and Clarabelle's marriage. And we would laugh. Not the tight-lipped social kind. Real laughter, the kind that takes up space. As I finalized the place cards, I thought about what Clarabelle would assume I'd be doing on Christmas Day. Probably watching a Hallmark movie alone, heating up a casserole, clutching her latest photo book filled with pictures I wasn't in. And part of me briefly wished I could tell her the truth. Not out of spite, just to see the look on her face when she realized I didn't need her pity. But I wouldn't, because this wasn't about her. It was about me, and the room I had finally learned to fill. The ornaments were handmade. The crystal was heirloom. The power in the room was unspoken but undeniable. I started decorating the week after Clarabelle's message. Not out of joy, out of clarity. I wasn't performing Christmas for them anymore. This year, I was building something for myself. Something quieter, more potent. A version of the holiday not rooted in tradition, but in transformation. The garland was real pine, laced with cinnamon sticks and dried orange slices I'd made myself like my grandmother taught me. The ornaments were all handmade. Paper stars, brass bells, tiny needle-felted birds that I used to hang with Clarabelle when she still thought whimsy was magic and not embarrassment. I took out the heirloom crystal, each piece still in its original satin-lined box, and set them on the sideboard with the same reverence Clarabelle now reserved for luxury handbags. In the foyer, I lit tall beeswax candles that smelled faintly of honey and old wood. I polished the silver cutlery Roderick and I had received at our wedding gifted by a distant aunt who believed a woman should have at least one thing in her life that glittered without asking permission. The tree went up in the front room, just off the library. Not oversized, not dripping with LED lights, just tall enough to brush the ceiling and wide enough to carry the weight of memory. Beneath it, instead of presents, I placed first editions and journals tied with velvet ribbon. Knowledge, I thought, is the only thing worth unwrapping at this stage of life. The doorbell rang precisely at 4:00 p.m. on the 23rd. "Tess," I said, opening the door. "You look like Paris in a hurricane." She grinned, hair tousled, scarf trailing behind her like she'd run through a poem. "I brought you something," she said, hoisting a leather duffel and a half-eaten croissant. And by something, I mean me. Tess Von Me niece on Roderick's side. Age 31, filmmaker, devourer of irony, allergic to social pleasantries. She was the only one who ever truly saw me, even when I was doing my best to disappear. She glanced around the entryway. "God, Aunt Marcy, this place looks like Wes Anderson was hired by the New York Times." "I'll take that as a compliment," I said, passing her a glass of cider. "It is. And you smell like pine and existential revenge. Are we ready to blow Clarabelle's mind?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We worked together into the evening. She arranged place cards in her impeccable script names, written with the kind of care reserved for wedding vows and fine poetry. She made them elegant, sharp, deliberate. "Governor Bellamy sits here," she said, tapping the head of the table. "And I'm putting Delilah beside the fireplace. She loves firelight. It makes her skin glow like moonstone. And she knows it." I smiled, watching her work. Tess had the kind of confidence Clarabelle used to have before it calcified into self-protection. Where Clarabelle had polished herself into an accessory, Tess had grown into a blade. At one point, Tess opened the Christmas box, the red and green plastic tub I pulled out every year, even when no one cared. She reached in and pulled out the old stockings, each one hand-embroidered with a name. "Clarabelle?" she read aloud. "Still here." I took it from her, folded it slowly, and set it aside. "No place for it this year?" "There's always a place," I said, "just not at this table." Instead, I reached for one of Tess's calligraphy cards, pressed it flat, and handed it to her. "Write this," I said. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote, in a crisp, sweeping hand, Governor Bellamy. I placed it on the mantel, right where Clarabelle's stocking used to hang between the cedar wreath and the oil painting of Roderick in his dress uniform. And for a moment, I simply stood there. Not mourning, not celebrating, just existing. This wasn't the holiday I planned. But it was, without question, the one I needed. A holiday without pretenses, without forced smiles or shallow compliments about table settings. A holiday where the presence in the room came not from bloodlines, but from ideas, from respect, from conversations that lingered like perfume long after the guests had gone. I poured myself a small glass of cognac and sat by the fire while Tess made edits to her documentary footage in the corner. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. "I'm not just okay," I said. "I'm finally unfolded." She blinked at me. "That's not a word." "It should be." And in that room filled with scent and light and memory, I finally understood what it meant to decorate for oneself, not for the people who left, not for the ones who never looked closely enough to see the effort, but for the woman I had become, alone, and entirely on purpose. I wasn't invited to their gathering, but I saw it all on Instagram. The first story went up at 6 a.m. on Christmas morning. Clarabelle had always been punctual, even in performative grief and seasonal joy. Tess spotted it first. She was curled up in the armchair near the bay window, scrolling her phone while sipping a blood-orange mimosa, her legs tucked under her like a cat surveying its kingdom. "Oh," she said, lifting her eyebrows. "We have visual confirmation from the Langstons' mountain retreat." I didn't look up from my notepad, where I was adjusting the final seating arrangement for the reception later that evening. I had decided to shift the governor closer to the fireplace. She liked warmth, and I'd heard she appreciated old books and political gossip shared over cognac. Tess continued narrating with the dry cadence of a BBC wildlife documentary. Slide 1. Matching family pajamas. All white and gold. Tasteful. Sterile. Slide 2. Michael popping champagne next to a chalet window. Slide 3. Oh, look, a quiet moment of gratitude in front of an artificially flocked tree the size of a small European cathedral. I finally glanced up. Are there children holding endangered animals again? Not yet, but I give it 10 minutes. Clarabelle loved optics. She always had. Even as a child, she would arrange her toys in photo-ready tableaux, scolding her teddy bear for slouching. But after marrying into the Langstons, it evolved into something Elsine Olympic-level commitment to appearing perpetually composed. Their Christmases had become cinematic, all drone shots and monogrammed everything. I could have sworn last year's card had a production team. Another story uploaded. This one, a boomerang of Michael's mother, Deborah, clinking glasses with Clarabelle in front of a roaring fire. The caption read, "So grateful to spend the holidays surrounded by grace, strength, and generational love. Christmas with the Langstons." Grace, strength, generational love. All hashtags, none directed at me. Tess turned the phone toward me. "Wanna see?" I didn't. But I did. Clarabelle looked perfect. Of course she did. Her hair was styled in a low bun with a velvet ribbon. Her makeup was tasteful, subdued. Her smile the exact shape of tolerance. The photo was technically flawless. Balanced composition, soft lighting, nothing real. I took a long sip of champagne and said nothing. Instead, I stood, walked to the drinks tray, and began refilling glasses. Tess followed, placing her phone face down. "You okay?" she asked. "Why wouldn't I be? She posted 37 photos, none of which mention you." "I'm aware. I mean, you gave her everything." I shrugged, lifting the bottle and watching the bubbles rise in a fresh glass. I gave her everything she asked for. That's not the same thing. Behind us, the house was already humming. The caterers were arranging hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. Stellan, the pianist from New Orleans, was tuning his baby grand in the corner. The smell of cedar, citrus, and duck confit curled through the air like a subtle declaration. I glanced toward the window, where the early afternoon light spilled over the snowy street. Just outside, 3 black SUVs idled in a clean diagonal along the curb. Tess followed my gaze and grinned. "They're here, Margaret's team, and is that?" "Yes. That's a news van parking across the street. It was. Not paparazzi. Not scandal chasers. Just one local journalist from a political column, tipped off by the guest list, and intrigued by the fact that Governor Bellamy had chosen to spend Christmas at the private residence of a retired professor. The term made me chuckle. Retired from what exactly? I adjusted the pearl clasp at my neck and turned toward the door. My reflection in the hall mirror caught my eye in a silk gown, swept back hair, posture like I belonged exactly where I was. Because I did. I could imagine what Clarabelle might think if she saw me now. Would she be confused, jealous, embarrassed? Would she assume I was trying to prove a point? But the truth was simpler. I wasn't proving anything. I was just living. Clarabelle's perfect Christmas would rack up likes and hearts and polite comments from people she barely knew. Her children would unwrap curated gifts and sip hot cocoa from mugs printed with words like magic and believe. And later that night, her phone would buzz again and again as photos of my reception began to circulate. Photos of the governor laughing beside me. Photos of Delilah Chen leaning in to hear my opinion on literacy equity. Photos of a room not filled with wrapping paper and forced grins but with substance. And when those images reached her feed, I hoped Clarabelle would feel something. Not shame. Not envy. Just the soft, unfamiliar ache of realizing she had never asked who I became once I stopped waiting for an invitation. I didn't post a thing, but the society pages did. It was Margaret's press secretary who tipped them off. Not intentionally, of course. She simply mentioned it in passing to a columnist over lunch, something about the governor's refreshing choice to forego pomp in favor of intellectual intimacy. The columnist, who usually covered state education funding and civic arts grants, perked up. By the morning of December 26th, the headline had made it into the city's most read political newsletter. Retired professor hosts governor and state leaders for private holiday salon. Beneath it, a photograiny but elegant captured the governor laughing mid-sip, seated beside me in my dining room. My hand was resting gently on the table, eyes narrowed in amused concentration, as Delilah Chen gestured with a cocktail pick toward a bowl of candied citrus peels. I hadn't even noticed the photographer. The caption read, Marcella Vaughn, former academic and current board advisor to 3 major education initiatives, hosted a quiet Christmas salon attended by Governor Margaret Bellamy, tech CEOs, nonprofit leaders, and key literacy reform advocates. The menu was crafted by Chef Bennett Lewis, with music by New Orleans pianist Stellan Ames. No hashtags, no filters, just facts. Tess showed me the article around noon. She didn't say anything, just set her phone on the table while I stirred a pot of mulled wine, the scent of cinnamon and orange curling around us like a lullaby. I read it twice. Then Tess said, dry as ever, "You realize this is how revolutions start, right? First the mimosas, then the literacy takeovers." I chuckled and returned to the stove. We didn't talk about Clarabelle. Not yet. But I knew the clock had started ticking. At 2:17 p.m., the first ripple reached social media. A repost of the article, shared by a mid-tier political commentator who captioned it, "Why am I just now learning about Marcella Vaughn? Women like her are the reason policy still has a soul." At 3:41 p.m., an arts publication reposted one of the photos, this time a wide shot of the table lit by candlelight, the room full but hushed. I was turned slightly, speaking to Margaret, while Tess and Delilah leaned in from opposite sides. By 6:00 p.m., Marcella Vaughn was trending modestly, but unmistakably on regional Twitter. And by midnight, my phone had 48 missed calls. It started with Michael's mother, Deborah, then Clarabelle, then Michael, then Clarabelle again, 6 times in a row, as if her voice would carry more weight through repetition. I didn't answer any of them. Tess, curled up under a knit blanket with her laptop open, simply looked up and said, "They just realized you were never the supporting act." I smiled. Not smug, not cruel, just tired. Because she was right. They had cast me for years as the background character, the soft-focus maternal figure who showed up with pies and disappeared before the second course. I had let them write that version of me, even when I knew better. I had handed them the pen out of love, out of guilt, out of habit. But now the narrative had shifted, and I hadn't written a single word of it. I'd simply lived openly, intentionally, without apology. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because the world had started paying attention, because my name was now being said in rooms they respected. Clarabelle, in particular, must have been reeling. For years, she had positioned herself as the forward-facing woman of the family. Michael's press releases, Deborah's charity galas, the curated family image. It all revolved around her ability to command a space. And now, suddenly, her retired mother had outshone the entire Langston holiday production with a few candlelit conversations and a seating chart. Tess poured us both a glass of leftover champagne and raised hers in a toast. To power, she said, and to not needing to prove anything to people who never bothered to ask. I clinked glasses with her, letting the silence stretch. There was a moment, just before I went to bed, when I stood at the window and looked out across the snowy street. The SUVs were gone. The guests had left with promises to reconnect, to collaborate. My inbox now held invitations to 3 new board opportunities and 1 keynote address. But none of that was the victory. The victory was this. I hadn't chased it. I hadn't chased anything. I'd simply stopped making myself small, and when I did, the world rearranged around me. My phone buzzed again. Clarabelle. One more time. I set it gently on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and whispered to no one in particular. Let them call. I'm no longer answering to absence. It wasn't guilt in her voice, it was confusion, because she didn't know who I really was. The call came at 8:02 the next morning. Tess was still asleep in the guest room, the New York Times folded over her chest, like a soft declaration of protest against early hours. I was already awake, seated at the kitchen table with my notebook, reviewing a policy brief for the Orion Civic Alliance. The kettle had just started to whistle when the screen lit up. Clarabelle. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. 5 seconds. Then 10. My thumb hovered over the screen. Not out of indecision, just curiosity. What version of herself would she send me this time? I answered just as the call was about to end. Hello? There was a beat of silence, and then, Mom? Her voice was oddly tentative. Not small, but uncertain. Like someone trying to place a familiar painting in a gallery she no longer recognized. Good morning, Clarabelle. Another pause. Then a breath measured, shallow. I saw the photos. Of course you did. I figured, I said, stirring honey into my tea. They were quite popular. She hesitated again. Why didn't you tell us you were hosting the governor? Her tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even hurt. It was something stranger. Confusion? Yes. But layered with something more disorienting, like walking into a room and realizing the furniture has been rearranged. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted her to sit in the question, to realize, perhaps for the first time, that information is a privilege and not an entitlement. You never asked what I was doing this year, I said calmly. A silence fell between US dense and clumsy. We just assumed. I let that hang in the air. Assumed. Yes, that word did a lot of work in our relationship. Assumed I'd be alone. Assumed I'd be watching reruns in soft slippers. Assumed I'd be available the moment they remembered I existed. I'm glad you had a nice time at the lodge, I said, keeping my voice even. We did. I mean, yes, it was beautiful, but it's not the same. Her voice softened. It didn't feel quite right. Things rarely do when you've left something behind without looking back. I didn't say it as a weapon. I said it like a fact. Like reading the label on a jar before deciding if you want to keep it. Michael's voice came on next. I hadn't realized we were on speaker. Hi, Marcella. He always called me that. Never Mom. Never even Marcy. Just Marcella. Like he was speaking to an HR representative with a slightly inconvenient opinion. Michael. So, we were thinking, maybe we could stop by next week? Say hello? Talk things through? I took a slow sip of tea, glancing at the sunlight crawling across the floor like a cat that owned the place. Next week? Yeah, just, You know, a quick visit. Maybe bring the kids. We could. My calendar is full through January, I said flatly. Silence. Heavy this time. Oh, he said. I see. I doubted he did. Clarabelle jumped in, her voice higher now, trying to smooth the moment with the old Tonitha one she used when she wanted to control the room with civility. Of course, Mom. I'm sure you're just busy with the holiday wrap-up. I didn't mean to spring anything on you. I let her fill the space. She was good at wrapping disappointment in charm, at turning unmet expectations into misunderstandings. I understand, she said, though I wasn't sure what she meant. We just didn't know you were so involved. You didn't ask. Another pause. I guess I didn't realize how much you were doing. That's because you weren't looking. I didn't mean it unkindly. I meant it truthfully. They had spent so many years treating me like the elegant backdrop to their performance always present, never participating, the holder of coats, the bringer of pies, the one who clapped from the wings. And now? Now they were calling the woman who had just appeared on 3 nonprofit newsletters, whose dinner guest list included 2 tech moguls and a governor. They weren't calling to reconnect, they were calling to recalibrate. Well, Michael said finally, if anything changes, let us know. I will, I said, and ended the call before they could linger. I sat there for a moment, cradling the warmth of the teacup in both hands. It wasn't anger I felt. It was peace. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was simply living in plain sight. She thought I'd leave her teacups and a sewing machine. She never imagined the portfolio. Roderick had been meticulous in death, just as he was in life. A man of strategy, even when the only enemy left was time. I remember the envelope. Heavy linen, sealed with his initials pressed in red wax. It arrived 3 days after his funeral, delivered by a woman with a last name that sounded like old law and older buildings. It contained a letter, 5 pages, handwritten, his script as precise as his marching orders had once been, and a single sentence underlined at the bottom of the first page. You never needed my permission to build your own empire, but in case you ever want the keys to one, I've left the foundation. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. Attached were the documents, the full ledger of a real estate and policy trust he had spent the last 2 decades managing in quiet. Properties in 3 states, small investments in education, focused tech startups, a stake in a public-private development initiative focused on underserved housing, and most critically, a long-term allocation plan for a civic legacy fund that bore my name as both custodian and executor. Clarabelle had never asked what her father left behind. I doubt she even considered there was something worth asking about. To her, he was a story, a folded uniform in a cedar chest. A man remembered more through flag ceremonies than through financial foresight. She assumed, I'm sure, that my silence meant there was nothing left. But I had inherited more than old war medals and sepia-toned photos. Roderick had given me power not in the form of status, but of choice, of longevity, of the ability to act without begging, to give without emptying. And I had kept it hidden not out of malice, but out of design. I watched Clarabelle grow into a woman who gauged worth by visibility, who measured success by how well it photographed, who believed that the legacy she would one day inherit would be purely symbolica, few heirloom brooches, a dusty university chair, maybe a mahogany sideboard or 2. She thought I'd leave her my teacups, my sewing machine, a collection of outdated paperbacks and a file full of handwritten recipes. She never imagined the portfolio, and that suited me just fine. Because wealth, I had learned, does its best work in quiet. I began meeting with estate planners not long after the holiday salon. In the new year, my calendar was filled with appointments, trust consultants, legal advisors. A foundation strategist named Eliza who wore monochrome suits and always arrived with thick binders labeled Possible Futures. We met every Thursday at 10 a.m. in a small office overlooking the city. Eliza had a way of speaking that made even the most intimidating spreadsheets feel like gentle possibilities. I don't want something splashy, I told her. I want something permanent, something that endures longer than the people who underestimated it. She smiled. Then we build from the ground up. We began drafting the blueprint for the Vaughan Foundation for Civic Scholarship, named not after me, but after Roderick, because he had started the work, and I would finish it. The foundation would provide scholarships for students pursuing public policy, education reform, or military to civil leadership transitions exactly the sort of underfunded, unglamorous paths that built the infrastructure of the country, but rarely made headlines. Each scholarship would come with mentorship, housing stipends, and placement support, not just a check, but a path. I want the selection process to focus on resilience, I told Eliza one morning. Grades, yes, but also grit. I want the girl who raised her siblings while finishing school, the boy who cared for his grandmother while working night shifts, the students who know what it means to sacrifice before they ever step into a seminar room. Those are the ones who change things, Eliza nodded. Quietly. Effectively. I smiled. Exactly. The foundation would be headquartered in a modest but modern office space, donated by one of my former board colleagues. The logo, designed by Tess, was simple. A quill intersecting with an oak leaf. Strength and voice. Rootedness and agency. Not bad, for a retired professor. I still hadn't told Clarabelle. It wasn't secrecy anymore. It was self-preservation. She hadn't asked what I'd inherited, and I didn't feel the need to correct her assumptions. Let her keep her mental image of me sorting linens, dusting shelves, reminiscing in soft light. Because the truth was far more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. The truth was that while she and Michael played at legacy donor galas and dinner speeches, I was out building one. Quietly. Deliberately. Brick by philosophical brick. I didn't need her validation. I had something better. Impact. They wanted access to my resources, not to my presence. It came 3 days after the article. That's how I thought of it, now capitalized, italicized, already archived in the family memory as the moment things changed. By then, the reception photos had made their quiet rounds through the donor circuits and social media networks that Michael's family claimed not to care about, but obsessively monitored nonetheless. I could feel the energy shift in every interaction, not just a thawing, a recalculation. The phone calls became more frequent, no longer daily voicemails filled with halting apologies or vague invitations, but carefully structured message, emotionally baited, just personal enough to feel intentional. Clarabelle's voice, always smooth as glass, had taken on a practiced softness, a shift in tone, designed to sound maternal in reverse. On the 4th voicemail, she finally used the angle I'd been waiting for. Emma misses you, Mom. She was so sad you weren't at Christmas. I stood in the foyer listening to that line play out in the air like a single flute, noted delicate, purposeful, hollow. Emma, 17. Bright, polished, social media fluent. The kind of girl who said, "Grandma, you're so vintage whenever I wore anything with buttons." The kind of granddaughter who once asked me what I used to do before I retired, right in front of a bookshelf lined with my publications. She hadn't ignored me maliciously, just absent-mindedly, like one ignores an old painting on the wall of a house they grew up in. Decorative, static, always there. And now, I was being summoned back into relevance. Tess had been in the kitchen when the voicemail came through. She'd paused, one eyebrow raised over her cup of coffee, like a cat catching the scent of something expensive and suspicious. "Ah," she murmured, "the but Emma misses you gambit. Classic maneuver." I smiled. "Textbook. Are you going to respond?" "Yes," I said, with precision. I called Clarabelle that evening, just before dinner, early enough not to seem confrontational, late enough to suggest I'd had a full, structured day. She picked up on the second ring. "Mom," as if nothing had happened. "How are you?" she continued quickly. "We've been thinking about you." "Have you?" She laughed lightly. "Yes, of course. And Emma, well, Emma really misses you." "I heard." "She was asking when she could see you. She's been looking through old photos, saying how she wishes you'd been at the lodge." "I'd love to see Emma," I said calmly. "She's welcome to visit. Alone." Silence. I could practically hear her blinking on the other end of the line. "Oh, well, I thought maybe we'd all stop by together." "I don't think that's necessary," I said, not unkindly. I'd like to spend some real time with Emma. Just the two of us. Another pause. Longer this time. I filled it with my own quiet. Clarabelle regrouped, her voice softening further. It's just that we wanted to come as a family. You made it clear, Clarabelle, I said, who your family was this Christmas. There it was. The first hairline crack in the performance. That wasn't meant as an exclusion. No, I said gently. It was meant as a priority. And you're allowed to make priorities. I just think it's time I made some of my own. I could hear the rustle of her silk sleeve she always fiddled with her clothing when she was thrown off. Emma will be thrilled, she said finally, a touch too brightly. I'll tell her to text you. Wonderful. I'm free Tuesday afternoon. She can come for tea. The conversation ended quickly after that. Civil. Controlled. Hollow in all the right places. But I sat there for a long time afterward, fingers laced around my teacup, watching the light change across the dining room table. They wanted access again. Not to me. Not to my company or conversation or inconvenient insights. To my resources. My relevance. My name now whispered in the same breath as boardrooms and funders. My photo beside the governor. My reach. But they would only get me in pieces now. The piece willing to see Emma? Still intact. The part that once chased inclusion? Gone. Tess walked in later with 2 glasses of wine and raised one toward me. Well handled, she said. Surgical. You should teach a class. I did, I said. For 37 years. Right, she grinned. But now you're finally applying it to your real life. I laughed, clinked her glass, and thought, yes, I am. And I'm no longer granting full access just because someone remembers how to knock. Love without curiosity isn't love. It's convenience. Clarabelle didn't ring the doorbell. She walked in the way children do when they still think of a house as their 7 when they've long stopped asking who cleans the corners and oils the hinges. I was in the sitting room folding linen napkins, the kind embroidered with initials no one remembered anymore except me. My hands moved in measured rhythm. Muscle memory from 100 hosted dinners and 1,000 silences. Mom? I looked up. Clarabelle stood in the doorway with her coat still buttoned, her face flushed from the January winter nerves. It was hard to tell with her. She had inherited her father's bone structure but my inability to show vulnerability without strategy. She lingered a second, unsure whether to step forward. I didn't speak. I simply nodded toward the chair across from me. The invitation was soft but unmistakably conditional. She sat. There was a pause, longer than etiquette allows, but shorter than healing requires. Then she began. I owe you an apology, she said, voice shaking just slightly. For Christmas. For how everything unfolded. Unfolded. As if events had simply bloomed without her hands on them. I let her continue. I should have told you earlier. About the lodge, about our plans with Michael's family. It wasn't fair to spring it on you like that. Spring it. Another euphemism. Another softening. Clarabelle, I said, folding the last napkin. You didn't just leave me out. You replaced me. She flinched. Not dramatically, but enough. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. Tears welled in her eyes, catching on the rims like dew. I didn't mean it that way. But you did, I said gently, because if you hadn't meant it, you would have noticed. You would have asked. You would have wondered where I was spending Christmas or with whom. But you assumed I was alone. And more than that, you were comfortable with it. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were no good counter-arguments to a truth someone has lived. I was embarrassed, she said finally. After the articles came out, the photos, everyone kept asking me why I hadn't mentioned you were hosting the governor, or how we could possibly have missed it. I tilted my head. And what did you tell them? That I didn't know. And did you reflect on why you didn't? She blinked. Eyes. I didn't realize you were doing all that. The foundation, the boards, the networks, it just never came up. No, I said softly, because you never asked. You were never curious. And love without curiosity isn't love. It's convenience. Clarabelle wiped at her cheek, mascara smudging faintly. You've always been so independent. So private. I thought you didn't want to share those parts. I nodded. There's truth to that. But you didn't try. You built a version of me that stayed in the kitchen, that mailed birthday cards and baked apple crisps. And when I offered more, you declined politely, or distracted yourself, or looked over my shoulder. I didn't know how far the distance had grown, she whispered. That's because you stopped measuring. She stared at the floor, and for once, there was no counterpoint, no deflection, just silence. Then she asked the one question I knew was coming. Will I be invited next Christmas? I looked at her. Not the woman who had just walked in, but the little girl I once held during winter storms, who used to ask if angels like gingerbread. The teenager who once confessed, I want to be someone with a voice, and didn't realize yet that her mother already was. And now, the grown woman who had confused visibility with love and was slowly waking up to the difference. That depends, I said. Her eyes lifted. On what? On whether you show up as my daughter, I said, or as my PR manager. She swallowed hard. I don't want your spotlight, Mom. I'm not offering it, I said. I'm offering a place at the table. Same as before, but this time, you have to earn the seat back with presence. Not optics. She nodded. The conversation didn't end with a hug. There were no dramatic reconciliations or sweeping promises. But she stayed a little longer. Asked about the foundation. Listened, for once, without prepping her next sentence. And when she left, she took off her shoes before walking out just like she used to, when she still believed this house was sacred. The Education Initiative is launching this spring with a 2M grant in my name. I flew to Washington, D.C. on the second week of March, 3 months after the Christmas that redefined everything. The cherry blossoms hadn't yet bloomed, but the city already buzzed with the anticipatory energy of spring. Panels, conferences, lobbyists and policy wonks in every hotel lounge, all rehearsing their pitches and agendas like actors in a play that only power could direct. I wasn't there as an ornament. I was there as chair. The National Initiative for Equitable Learning Access NELA was officially launching, with me as its inaugural head. The announcement came with a quiet splash in national education circles, a $2 million grant in my name, earmarked for scaling localized learning systems in underserved communities. Structured, sustainable, and most importantly mine to architect. The same week the launch went public, I received requests from 3 universities. Would I consider mentoring their doctoral candidates, leading a colloquium, writing a foreword for a new textbook? I said yes to 2, and gently declined the third, not out of pride but preference. I finally had the right to choose how my voice was used. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was living not after something but into something. In D.C., during a keynote roundtable on policy resilience, a moderator introduced me as Dr. Marcella Vaughn, civic leader and education strategist. I smiled, not because the title mattered, but because it fit again. Afterward, as I walked back through the hotel lobby wearing a cobalt suit, Roderick had once called my public armor. I stopped at a quiet corner cafe and opened my planner. It wasn't filled with birthdays or grocery lists anymore. Now, it held site visits, donor calls, and a notation with Tess's name beside it. Film crew arriving next month documentary pre-interviews. Tess had approached me 2 weeks earlier. A story like yours doesn't get told unless someone tells it, she said. And I'm tired of watching stories like Clarabelle's dominate the narrative. I agreed on one condition, that it highlight not me, but the ripple effect. The students, the teachers, the communities empowered by structure over spotlight. She smiled. Then we'll start with the scholarship clause. That's cinematic gold. The clause. Yes. I had written it myself, with my estate attorney shaking her head and smiling the entire time. In the trusts I'd established for Emma and Jasper College tuition, housing support, and a yearly academic development stipend, there was one condition: no parental access. Not advisory, not supervisory, not even visibility into disbursements. The funds would be administered by a third-party trustee, triggered only when the child reached 18 and maintained a GPA of 3 or higher. They would be accountable only to themselves, and the terms set by a grandmother who believed in autonomy over approval. When my attorney asked if I wanted to include a clause for early withdrawal under family hardship, I said no. If there's hardship, I told her, they can knock on my door themselves. She didn't ask further. She understood. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about recalibration. Clarabelle and Michael had built their lives on a certain assumption, that appearances were the same as reality, that a woman like me, quiet, composed in pearls and linen, was the support beam, not the structure. But I was the house. And now, brick by brick, I was renovating it. Clarabelle had not argued when she learned about the trusts. Not directly. She had merely sent a text. Understood. Thank you for thinking of them. To which I replied, thinking of them is my job. Explaining it to you is not. She did not respond after that. But Emma did. A week later, she asked if we could talk about community colleges. I told her I'd clear my calendar for Sunday. And Jasper? He was too young still, barely 8. But I'd already made a note to send him a telescope next Christmas, with a card that read, "For seeing further than the people around you expect you to." Back home, the air was quiet again. But it was no longer the silence of being overlooked. It was the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to build. My legacy was no longer a secret. It was in motion. In paperwork and programs, in trust funds and televised forums, in tea dates and private scholarships that bore the name of a man who'd believed in my mind long before anyone else did. And I, Marcella Von Mother, widow, professor, strategist, and finally, woman unbeholden, was living not in response to what was withheld, but in full ownership of what was mine all along. They'd once hoped I'd stay quiet. Now they wondered when I'd return their calls. It started with a phone call I almost didn't pick up. The name blinked on my screen, Emma Vaughn. 17 years old. My granddaughter. The one who used to flinch when I brought over books instead of Beats headphones. The one who once whispered to her cousin at Thanksgiving, "Grandma's house smells like libraries." I answered with a calm, "Hello?" Silence for a second. Then her voice. "Hi, Grandma." There was something different in her tone. Not the performative affection of holiday greetings. Not the guarded formalities of family obligation. Just a soft, nervous earnestness I hadn't heard since she was a child. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" "For the trust fund. And the telescope. And for, I don't know, for not needing anything from me to do it." I let her words linger, then said, "You're welcome." Another pause. "Can I come visit this weekend?" she added. "Just us. I want to ask you something. About school. And about your life. The parts I never asked about before." That was when my throat caught. Not because I needed the visit, but because she had finally made the choice to want it. "Of course," I said. "We'll have tea. You can help me reorganize the study." Her laugh was shy. "That sounds terrifying." "It is," I replied. "But you'll survive." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "Okay. See you Saturday." The call ended. But the silence that followed was rich, not hollow. The silence of being anticipated, not ignored. Later that week, I opened my email and saw a message from Jasper's school account. Subject line: "My real hero, Grandma Vaughn." It was a short video essay, 3 minutes. Grainy footage, homemade editing, a title card with Comic Sans that made me smile. But what followed? Gold. A boy of 8 standing in front of a crayon drawing of a woman at a desk, holding a book with a glowing heart in the center. "My grandma helps schools," he said into the camera, a little too close to the lens. "And she's really smart. And she doesn't yell, but when she talks, people listen. I want to be like that." I watched it twice. Then forwarded it to Tess with the subject line, "Consider this your Oscar competition." She replied with one word: speechless. Me too, if I'm honest. And then a surprise. A letter. Handwritten. In blue ink on cream stationery. Slightly slanted script. And the signature at the bottom. Michael Ellery Moore. Clarabelle's husband. It read, "Dear Marcella, this is long overdue. And likely inadequate. But I felt I needed to say something not for appearances but for the record. And maybe for peace. I misjudged you. Completely. I saw your elegance and humility as passivity. I assumed wrongly that quiet meant inconsequential. I know now how wrong I was. Your Christmas gathering reminded many of us that leadership doesn't shout. It doesn't always run for office. Sometimes, it simply opens its door, and the right people show up. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I see it now. All of it, and I'm sorry. With respect, Michael. I folded the letter gently. Did I believe every word? Perhaps. But more importantly, he had written it. Unasked, unprovoked, unscripted. That was new. I didn't write back. Sometimes silence is not distance, it's dignity. That week, the phone rang more than usual. Invitations, questions, requests. The people who once waited for me to shrink now wondered when I'd call back. And in those pauses between emails from policy fellows and tea dates with Emma, I felt the soft, seismic shift of a life realigned. It wasn't about applause. It was about being missed. For too long, my presence had been assumed and my absence unexamined. Now, every return of mine would be chosen, not expected. And for a woman like me, a woman once written into the margins of her own family's story that was the purest kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be loud. Because when it's real, silence echoes. I used to say, of course, out of obligation. Now I say it out of choice. Rome in December is a contradiction in velvet. There's the quiet chill in the air. Yes, but also orange trees still dotted with fruit, piazzas glowing in gold lights, and laughter rising like steam from espresso bars. It is not a city that lets you feel forgotten. It insists on reminding you that life, in its mess and motion, still belongs to those willing to walk its cobbled streets with purpose. And this year, I walked those streets in low heels, a wool coat that once belonged to Roderick, and a leather passport case tucked under my arm, one stitched with my initials in gold foil, MV. The case had been a gift from Margaret Bellamy's husband, Everett, a man I'd come to respect for his wit, his restraint, and his uncanny ability to pair wines better than any sommelier I'd ever met. This one, he had said at dinner the night before, is for women who don't ask to be taken seriously. They simply are. We had laughed, but I had blushed, quietly. That morning, we were preparing to drive from Rome to Siena, a few days of slow countryside before heading to Florence for Christmas Eve. My phone buzzed once. A single message. Hi, Mom. I know it's short notice, but if you're not too busy, we'd love to have you for Christmas this year. Michael's parents are hosting, but we're carving out our own evening too, just us. If that interests you. Clarabelle. I looked at it for a moment. There were no apologies, no declarations, just a carefully worded, politely cautious invitation phrased like someone writing across a chasm they didn't know how to cross. And maybe that was enough. Because this time, the message didn't carry entitlement, it carried effort. I tapped out a response. Of course. Then I slid the phone into my coat pocket and closed the passport case with a soft snap. The difference, you see, was never in the phrase. It was in the posture. I had once said, of course, like an unpaid concierge ushering others through their comfort while quietly managing my own neglect. Now, I said it as a sovereign woman, one who could choose where to place her presence, her time, her grace. Italy this year. Perhaps Morocco next. I had promised Emma we'd do something wild for her 18th. Portugal, she'd suggested, or Tokyo. I want to go where people don't already have a story for me. I'd smiled. Then you're going with the right grandmother. Back in the car, Everett handed me a thermos of mint tea, and Margaret was on her phone, half listening to some senator trying to revise talking points she'd written weeks ago. Let him rewrite it, she murmured. It'll only make my version stronger. I almost laughed. She didn't realize how familiar that sounded. The road to Siena stretched ahead long, winding, laced with cypress trees. A landscape not unlike life, twisting, uneven, but stubbornly beautiful if you just kept driving. I thought of Clarabelle. Of the Christmas when she chose performance over presence. Of the years I let myself be the backdrop to someone else's painting. And I thought of the quiet revolution that followed, not with fireworks, but with formal gowns, op-eds, scholarship clauses, and champagne flutes passed around a dining room that had once felt like a mausoleum. Now? Now I wrote my story forward, not as retaliation, as restoration. My family hadn't erased me. Not really. They'd just forgotten to look up from their own mirror long enough to see who was holding the frame. And I? I didn't shatter it. I simply walked away and built a gallery of my own. Tell me if your family erased you. Would you rewrite your story like I did? Let me know below. And if this resonated, 2 other stories are waiting for you right here.